Hi everybody, my name is Christian. I will be the session moderator for today. We have two lovely presenters speaking today. They are the Lee brothers, Richard Lee and Martin Lee. I'll go ahead and give a quick introduction for the both of them. So first we have Martin Lee, MED, also a cartoonist for the other ones by Lee. After an early start in commercial advertising, Martin settled into his primary occupation and was an elementary school teacher for 25 years. He retired in 2016 and worked in an organic farm for the next 5 years. The murder of George Floyd, COVID-19 pandemic, and rise in anti-Asian hate crimes reawoken his desire and passion for art and social justice. In late 2020, he began learning to animate and started texting his brothers about his work. Within months, the other ones by Lee sprung to life. Martin quit his job, moved to Florida to be with the love of his life, and began a full-time career as a cartoonist. Now, in under 1.5 years of existence, the Lee brothers have collaborated on nearly 600 daily comics dealing with issues of otherness and social justice. Their work strives to provide alternative narratives and healing to a troubled 21st century. And then we have Richard Lee, PhD, Dr. Richard Lee, who is a distinguished McKnight University professor and distinguished university teaching professor in the Department of Psychology and Asian American Studies program at the University of Minnesota. He's a past president of the Asian American Psychological Association and former chair of the Asian Caucus of the Society for Research on Child Development. Dr. Lee is internationally recognized for his focus on experiences of discrimination, ethnic racial identity development, acculturation, and socialization of Asian American immigrant, refugee, adopted, and U.S.-born youth and families. Outside of teaching and research, he has consulted with Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, school districts, and nonprofit organizations on workplace bias, cultural competency, and diversity training. Since 2021, he has collaborated with his artist brother, Martin, to create the daily comic The Other Ones by Lee. So with those introductions out of the way, I will go ahead and pass it on to our wonderful speakers. I will also switch over to the presentation.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. I'd like to see everyone's faces. So this was a comic that we had made, basically describing the difference between the two of us. You want to talk a little bit about that, Rich?
Yeah, maybe we can, so what we thought we'd do for this session today is present some of the comics for those of you who are not familiar with our comic, The Other Ones by Lee. You can find the comic on social media currently, on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, as well as our website. And then we also have a limited edition, first edition book that is coming out that captures all the comics that we've done in the past year. And so what we thought we'd do is just present some of the comics for everyone here first before we go into sort of our talk and then the Q&A. And so the first slide, Christian, if you want to advance it, is really just sort of giving our two perspectives. So my brother and I have very different perspectives on how we approach the comic, and that's what makes it a collaborative comic versus a unified sort of, or two different voices being presented. And so this is just sort of a humorous take on that difference between the two of us.
I think the big difference is Rich would always say, "Oh, your comics that you make are so angry." And so he kind of brings them down, a little bit more academic. So this originally started as a parody of Charles Schulz's Peanuts comic strip. Mostly when I started to make the comics, just before I started making them, I had listened to a podcast where a cartoonist of color was drawing, and his child came up to him and said, "How come you don't draw people that look like us?" And at the time, I was animating a Peanuts music video, and realizing that I'm drawing Charlie Brown, and realizing that throughout my entire life, I don't think I've ever really drawn a person of color. That they were basically all white. And it just kind of made me, you know, question all the things that I was doing. And so then I created that first character right there. So after the murder of George Floyd in 2021 was the verdict came out. And shortly thereafter, there's the Atlanta killings that happened. COVID was in full bloom, and I was struggling with everything that was happening in the world, in my own life. And comics became my outlet for dealing with all this, and started texting them to Rich. And, you know, he not only is my brother, but has kind of become kind of like my de facto counselor. And helping me kind of like process through all these emotions that I was feeling. And, you know, I've basically had to kind of relearn everything that I've learned and look at things in a new perspective. And it's challenging.
I think one of the things that we've experienced and other scholars have talked about is how oftentimes in society, minoritized individuals don't realize how colonized their minds are. And so we often default to certain behaviors, certain expectations, certain languages without realizing that we are conveying narratives, portraying images that don't really reflect the diverse societies that we live in, the diverse experiences that we have. And I think that's part of what the comics have been trying to do, is provide a counter narrative that reflects the realities that we have experienced. And through that, there's been an effort to really try to make sense out of the world in a new way, rather than accepting these sort of dominant narratives that are fed to us in all different media, right? Comics is just one.
So again, the lack of, so what, as Rich was just saying about, you know, what's in the media and how things that are portrayed to us, and realizing that, you know, Charles Schulz, as a white male baby boomer from the Midwest, you know, created his comic strip in 1950, and Franklin was the only character of color throughout the strip, but he appeared in, if you can see there, I mean, less than 1%, over nearly 18,000 comic strips. And so that kind of like, you know, got me thinking about, well, what about all the other kids that live in that neighborhood? I mean, the children of color, what are they doing? What are they thinking of? And how are they reacting to the things that are happening in the world around them? And so very quickly, I had a half dozen characters, and we kind of took off from there.
And so I think the title of our comic strip, The Other Ones, is getting at this point that Martin brought up, like, where are the other ones? And rather than just having our experiences be othered, right, it's reclaiming our voice and centering their experiences, our collective experiences, in a more authentic, genuine way. I think that's part of what also Charles Schulz struggled with when he introduced the Franklin character, is that, as Martin's educated me on, that part of the reason he doesn't show up in very many strips is because he didn't know how to authentically represent the Black experience in a comic.
Yeah, and I'll touch on that a little bit later in our talk. So yeah, we already touched on this. I just want to add very quickly, if the people in the room have a question, just put it up in the chat and we'll see if we can get to it as we're speaking. So this is the very first Peanuts comic strip that appeared in 1950. And that is Shermie and Patty sitting on the sidewalk. And what struck me about that is from, reading the Peanuts comic strip is that, and even, in the television specials, the children are quite mean. And, a lot of bullying and teasing and, kind of making fun of each other. And, there are some sweet ones, but, his first strip was, here comes good old Charlie Brown. How I hate him. And I feel like that kind of set the tone of, that was 1950. And that strip ran for 50 years and is ingrained in our culture. And, for us as children, Peanuts was the first comic strip in our newspaper section. So we saw it every morning. And reading comics back then is like, that was your daily ritual. And, this was the first thing that we would see every morning. And, I can't help but think how much that informed my childhood growing up, seeing this and then not seeing any representation throughout.
So I think part of what we've been developing with our comic has been how do we use it to address these social injustices, to provide these different perspectives rather than the ones that are commonly found in traditional comics. But also, how can we use comics as a way to empower people and to give voice, to encourage people to think differently, to engage in these difficult conversations, and take that time to critically reflect on their own experiences and how it may relate to the experiences of the communities that they're living in and what they're experiencing in society. And so we try to balance with the comics, things that are happening currently in society with, bigger sort of issues that just are always around us in our everyday lives, as well as our own personal experiences. And what we try to do through parody is to, a part of what we often hear from our oldest brother, who was giving us early on feedback about the comic, was that he said, comics are supposed to be funny. And how do you make funny such horrible things happening in the news? And so that's part of the challenge as we're evolving as a comic creator is finding that balance between the serious nature of things and contesting those issues with also still finding humor in life and giving people hope, right? Because we can't just perseverate on the negative. That's what is often, that's sort of the implicit desire of white supremacy, right? Is to keep people oppressed in the negative, right? To keep us down. And so we can't play into that.
So this was the first actual comic that I made. This was dealing with an event that happened to us when we had just moved into a brand new home in, the nice part of town. I mean, there are brand new homes built, and, like our parents had kind of like, quote unquote, made the American dream. And shortly after we moved in, we, I don't know if you can read that. But basically woke up to get the newspaper and found a cross burning in our front yard. And so I made a comic about that and sent it to Rich. And then you want to finish that story, Rich?
Yeah, so I think one of the powerful things about this comic and the story behind it is that it happened when I was around 10 and Martin, you were probably around 12. And no one in our family, including our parents, ever talked about that event. And so it laid silent in all of our lives until maybe 30 plus years later, when Martin was visiting me in Minneapolis, and we had a conversation about it for the first time in our 40s. And so I think that's a powerful, that's the power of oppression and racism, is that it can silence people, and yet the damage, persists until we're able to talk about it in a way that allows us to begin to heal. And so the comic in many ways was capturing that process of healing.
Yeah, in the community that we grew up in, there were not many people of color. And so when I made this comic, a lot of my friends from high school follow me on Instagram, and they saw that, and they were, sending me messages like, I can't believe that happened to you, and, all these sorts of messages. But, I had no one to talk to about it, because no one else would really understand. And so we just brushed it aside. And, when it happened, we asked our dad about it, and the only thing he said was, bad people did this. And that was the only conversation we had about it. And, and like Rich said, we didn't talk about it for many years. And then he actually said, when we finally did talk about it, he said, I thought that was a dream. And starting to question our reality of what actually did happen during our childhood. And then, that kind of, for me at least, started all these things that had happened that I had just buried down deep inside, all started to come up, especially with, the rise of the anti-Asian hate crimes and murder of George Floyd and all that. So everything from my past came up on me, and and I was struggling with all that.
Mm-hmm.
The comics provided me relief.
I remember my dad saying stupid people, but that's how memory sometimes works.
Yeah.
Bad people, stupid people.
So as the comic progressed, from our childhood stories, recognizing that there was, lots of people were going through this, lots of people of color from marginalized communities, and starting to use those stories and expanding our character base, and just providing voice to the other ones who are living in that town.
Mm-hmm. So as we mentioned at the beginning, we weren't quite sure where this comic strip would be going. Initially, it was just for ourselves, and we were just posting them. But we have found over time that it's drawn the attention of the larger communities that we live in and beyond. And we know that educators from, middle school, high school, and college are using the comics in their lesson plans. We know that it's being also incorporated by researchers to help better convey or disseminate research findings. And so we do see a real link between using comics to not just communicate our experiences and our perspectives, but to reach broader audiences, as well as bringing into play messages that are important to get to the public, right? And so from when we think about health and public health, right, we have to think about how comics can play an important role in that way. And we'll talk a little more about that.
Not much to say on that one. It's just true. This comic was in response to I think his name was Christian Hall. He was a Chinese American adoptee who was experiencing some mental health issues in New York, I believe it was, and Pennsylvania. And so he, I guess, was trying to commit suicide, and then police told him to put his hands up, and he put his hands up, and he got shot and killed anyways.
I mean, so here is where we're trying to just show how hopeless sometimes it can feel, right? And to just, it's okay to communicate that and to have those feelings and to feel validated. And I think that's what we're trying to do with the comic, is to validate our experiences and the experiences of people in communities of color, because so often when we raise our voices, they're quickly silenced, or they're minimized, or they're denied. And sometimes just validating an experience or a feeling or a thought is what's necessary.
So this is our character Tomas being sent to the principal's office. What were you going to say, Rich?
I was just going to say, this is one of the things that we often think about in our head, but never actually communicate out loud. And so it's nice to have it be, have this character, Thomas, say something that we often think, but don't always feel comfortable to say.
And also for me, it was, this reaction to all these apologies that we're hearing, in the news, and apologies that are not apologies, and that whole, well, it wasn't my intention to, and it's like, nobody cares about your intention. This is what you did, and
right.
So I don't know if you can see that bottom, but it's this is a banned books free little library. This is the Diggy character, his little act of trying to make things right outside his school building there. This was from a tweet that I had seen. It seems to be a talking point right now.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of, what we're doing is not necessarily providing answers, but just providing scenarios of, at least for me, what seems obvious, and then just, I think that, the thing with the comics is because they're children and because they're recognizable, that they seem to hit a little bit differently if they were, say, stick figures or,
mm-hmm. This is a sort of in the same vein as that other one in terms of how the media and society tries to explain away the violence toward our communities.
Also for me, this is, what's been giving me hope as of late is that I feel like this is what Gen Z is doing, that they are calling out things, whether it's in school or, out in public, that they're, basically saying, like, this is wrong. I mean, these things are just not right. And they're questioning all these things and just giving voice to that. there you go.
So that's just a snapshot of some of the comics that we have been producing over the last year. As Martin mentioned early on, we've tried to highlight certain perspectives with our characters with diverse backgrounds. We're also trying to increase the number of characters that we have. Of course, a challenge with that is when you have an ensemble cast, it's hard to give everyone the same amount of pages, right? Perspectives.
Yeah, so I saw there's a question here of why did Schulz want to convey such messages to kids? From what I understand is that when he was a child, he was bullied a lot as a kid. And so a lot of the early comics were kind of his recollections of things that had happened to him. You know, but he also ran that strip for 50 years. So, you know, there was time to evolve. And, like one of the classic tropes is that Charlie Brown never gets to kick the football. And in one of his final interviews, after he had already done his last strip and had retired because of his health, he did an interview and he's, was like almost in tears. And he said, that Charlie Brown, he never did get to kick that football. And that was all within his power. But for some reason, he just never did it. And then right at the end, he had this regret of like how he could have done something different. So, at least for me is not, I feel like I've lived my adult life in regret in a certain respect and now wanting to kind of correct all that. And the comics have given me a way of doing that. Mostly because, Rich comes from this background in psychology and kind of helps cultivate these feelings that I'm having and puts into words the feelings that I have. Because if he were not the writer, the comics would not be where they are because they would just be angry comics, just full of hate and venom and just me poking like back, and, there's an audience for that. But now they are much more nuanced. Every now and then I'll slip in one just because I need to. Anyways, to go back to this thing about the Franklin character in Peanuts. So this Jewish woman, Harriet Glickman, wrote him a letter saying that because of the position that Schulz was in, by then he had been making the comic for 18 years. This was shortly after the assassination of MLK. So she wrote him a letter saying it would be wonderful if you could introduce a Black character. He wrote back to her saying that he didn't feel like he could do that without, he said, I would be very happy to try, but I am sure that I would receive the sort of criticism that would make it appear as if I were doing this in a condescending manner. It wasn't until Harriet Glickman got one of her Black friends to write to him, and he wrote saying, it would ease my problem of having my kids seeing themselves pictured in the overall American scene. Secondly, it would suggest racial amity in a casual day-to-day sense. And so, as we've been making these comics, a lot of the people who actually write to us, send us messages, have been saying, I'm sharing these with my children, my biracial children, and now they are seeing children who look like them, children who are having their experiences. And I think, that is the power behind it. And what we're hoping is going to change is that when you see someone that looks like you and having the same struggles, then you don't feel so alone. And, when we were kids, there were hardly any Asians on television other than on MASH, which wasn't even a show about Asian Americans, and then those depictions were just these stereotypes that we had to deal with, and even movies like The Karate Kid, I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard wax on, wax off, and all these things that, and so then these little microaggressions just like gnaw at you every day, and, I moved from Olympia, Washington, where I spent the majority of my adult life, and moved to Pensacola, Florida just last year. And, you know, Pensacola, Florida is the South. It's different than the Pacific Northwest, but so far in my experiences, I experienced more racism in the Pacific Northwest than I am in the South. Mostly because of microaggressions. You know, people who I guess are well-intentioned, but just say things that are so insensitive, you know, that I'm left speechless a lot of the time, and I didn't have it within me to correct that, you know. Um, you know, I'm at a different place now, but I'm still learning.
I just shared in chat my current situation.
Yeah.
I did want to, you know, talk a little bit about how I've been approaching the comic, and while Martin's coming at it from this personal perspective of trying to capture his own thoughts and feelings and experiences. As a licensed psychologist and psychology professor, I've been trying to find a way to use the comics to engage the larger public in what nowadays counseling psychologists of color have been referring to as radical healing, right? How can we collectively take back our voice and our experiences and define our own lives, and to do that in a way that is constructive, that is critical of the ways things have been structured for us, right? How do we resist those structures and change them, and yet do so in an authentic, genuine way, and do so without damaging ourselves, right? Because I think it's easy to fight, but in the process harming ourselves along the way. And so it's a balance between self-care and active resistance. And that's why I think comics are great, because there is humor involved, right? And it's also a very approachable medium that allows us to say things that we perhaps wouldn't feel comfortable saying ourselves. And, you know, comics, there is actually scholarship on comics. You know, Martin and I have been following a group of healthcare providers led by Ian Williams, who coined the term graphic medicine. And graphic medicine draws on narrative medicine, which historically has really tried to understand medicine and healthcare from the patient perspective, right? People who have different diseases and are in recovery or treatment. And graphic medicine sort of builds on that by adding, by visually embodying those narratives through comics, right? And I think our work kind of aligns well with graphic medicine in that way. And what the research shows is that graphic medicine comics tend to be effective as a persuasive tool, in part because what psychologists refer to as narrative transportation, that it transports the reader into a different frame of or perspective, right? And by doing that, they begin to experience or feel what the characters are feeling. It's the same thing that theater can do, or poetry, or literature. Comics can do the same thing, is that it can help the reader begin to feel something that maybe has been lurking in them, but they haven't been able to tap. And I think when we think about public health in particular, public health tries lots of innovative things to reach the public, but in the end, it defaults to the standard things like billboard ads, infographics, and those are static images and ways of communicating. Comics introduces you to the lives of these characters, and so it sucks you in more. And I think it would be a great way to better reach the public. We know that it works. The government has been doing this for hundreds of years, right? Uncle Sam, right, was introduced at World War I, right? Uncle Sam is a comic, right? Dr. Seuss was contracted by the US government to develop war propaganda using comics. So comics can be very effective, and yet we haven't quite figured out how to deploy it to address mental health and health issues.
Just to add to that, I think that's the thing in graphic medicine, is that because a lot of the stories are from the patient perspective, they're sharing their experiences. And, what the healthcare providers are seeing is that, if you're getting a diagnosis for breast cancer, well, there are graphic novels, comic books that are made dealing with these issues. And it's a lot easier for that patient to receive that information and to digest that information in a comic book form rather than in a lecture or in a pamphlet, in the ways that Rich is talking about, because they start to see themselves in those characters, just like when we watch a movie, you start to identify with certain characters. So now that's what our strip is doing, is, people are finding their way in those stories. And, we get messages of like, oh my gosh, that one that you just did yesterday, that happened to me. Or all our stories are the same stories. And, because of the way that Rich writes, is that instead of them just feeling like, this is a hopeless situation, here's how we're going to turn this into positive change, right? Here's how we are going to react to that situation. So putting our characters who are children in those situations where they are making good choices, right? And being able to show that in a daily format. I mean, that's the other thing, is that we produce at least one strip a day, if not more, and post. And, like I said, our queue is full of comics that are waiting to go, because life keeps happening, things keep happening, and there's just so many stories to tell, and it's just a matter of, finding the right timing. So how are we doing on time, Christian?
Good. If you'd like to, we can switch over to Q&A, answering some questions. If you want to go ahead and wrap up your presentation, we can also do that.
Christian, I think people are having a hard time hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is this a little bit better? Yeah. Yes. Okay. You're good on time. If you would like to switch over to Q&A, we can certainly do that. But if you want to wrap up your presentation really quickly, please feel free to.
I do have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
I did have one more thing to add about the way in which we create the comic. We typically use a 4-panel comic, and the 4-panel comic introduces the context to the issue, sort of a dilemma that emerges, and then we either end the comic typically with either a different perspective or humorous take on it, or with like a statement. But what we don't typically do is wrap it up neatly, because these are issues that don't wrap up neatly. And that's a difference, I think, from
Right.
like short stories or literature or movies, right? Where there's a conflict and then there's a resolution at the end.
Okay.
The way the comic works is that there is no resolution, but we have to keep living our lives. And that's part of the hope that we try to communicate using the comic form.
It still does come to a resolution, though, you know, because there are 4 panels. So there is a beginning, a middle, and an end, but it doesn't provide the answers. And I think what it does more is gets the reader to ask more questions and to look a little bit deeper. You know, early on when we were kind of covering a wide range of topics, you know, people would write saying, I had no idea. I had no idea. I had no idea. You know, now I have to Google that. What does that mean? You know? And so, you know, it stimulates conversation. And I think that's, you know, an important factor is that people continue to talk about these things. And I have not talked to the Schulz estate. Not really worried about being sued. I feel like this is a parody because, and I have found legal precedent that supports us in all that, you know, but it is the parody. I mean, like we are taking in order for it to be a parody, I have a definition here. Literary or artistic work that imitates the characteristic style of an author or a work from a comic for comic effect and ridicule. And that's kind of what we're doing, is pointing out like this, you know, this strip only represented one singular viewpoint, right? And there are thousands. And that's what our strip is addressing, is that we're putting these characters, not Schulz's characters, our own characters. They just happen to look like his characters. You know, and showing their situation.
Yeah, she gave me 224-607-3824. Okay. All right. Well, I will mark myself up with my little machine, and I will.
I hear a voice. I'm not sure who that is. Is that someone talking? That's Rich's library. Do we have any other questions?
I think one of the questions was also like, how could people who may not have experience with comic writing start this? Like, what advice would you give to somebody interested in writing comics or expressing themselves through comics? Similar to what y'all are doing.
Well, you know, I think Rich and I are in a unique perspective in that I'm the artist and he's the writer, and we're brothers. You know, so that's kind of made it easier, you know, even though, you know, as adults, we didn't spend a whole lot of time together, you know, we still are siblings, and, you know, and, you know, the writing part was the part that I was struggling with, and that was the part, and the art part is what he struggles with. So it's just a natural thing. So I would say, you know, for anyone, it's, you know, to find people that you can work with. You know, the story needs to be good. You know, you need to be able to concisely say what you want to say in 4 panels without tons of words. I mean, that's the challenge, is that, you know, you're taking something like, you know, the Me Too movement, and how do you put that into 4 panels, right? And have it wrap up in 4 panels, the whole topic. And, you know, so you need to be concise. And, you know, for me at least, you know, having Rich as my collaborator has helped me, you know, and, you know, because we are brothers, we're on the same wavelength. So even though we do everything by text, this is, you know, I think maybe the 3rd time I've seen his face this year, you know. We do everything by text. So, you know, we need to be concise in what we're saying. And because, you know, we are brothers, when I respond in a certain way, even if I just respond with an emoji, I feel like he knows exactly what I'm saying, and that there doesn't need to be any further communication. You know, I'm not sure if that answers that question completely.
Yeah, I just wanted to also add, I think a big challenge for academics or researchers is that we are indoctrinated to use big words. And maybe because of the way I was raised or my personality, I'm much more comfortable communicating in snippets and using casual language compared to more academic formal language. And so I think it just works out for me. I think it's hard for some people to talk about difficult issues in simple, plain language. But the reality is, right, the majority of the population don't talk with graduate education vocabulary, right? And, you know, it's not, I mean, on the one hand, you could say it's pretentious to only communicate in that way, but it's also just not practical. And comics are a very practical mode of communication. And so it works that Martin and I are on that wavelength in the style of how we communicate.
Someone wrote, how have I addressed people who find the comics offensive? Well, I've not gotten any messages that said that's an offensive comic. I've had people who are haters, and then I just block them. So, you know, I'm pretty, you know, I check our feed all the time, and I just look for the spam, the haters, and I just block them. I don't have time for that, you know. And basically, you know, if people do have questions, I mean, that's kind of the whole point, is that we're raising issues that need to be discussed in our society. You know, they need to be out front, and that's why we do a daily comic, is that it needs to be persistent. It needs to be there every day, all the time, and then that's how we get the narrative to shift and, you know, provide, you know, Gen Z with something different, a different reality than the ones that we grew up with, you know, where everything has been whitewashed, you know, and that's the hope that I see in Gen Z, is that they're not willing to take that. And that gives me a lot of hope. And so.
Yeah, in terms of have we ever partnered with kids to teach them to use comics as a way to communicate or talk about difficult issues? I have two answers to that. Is we, as I mentioned earlier, you know, we know that some middle school and high school teachers have used our comics in their lesson plans to introduce topics or to have conversations in their classroom. I've also, early on, during when a lot of anti-Asian hate was happening, which is still a lot happening, my friends and I brought our kids together and we showed them some of the comics. And, you know, these are 4th to 7th, 8th graders. And we had them have a conversation, see if they would have a conversation, and we kind of eavesdropped on them. And they were able to use the comics as a starting point for conversations. I think adults and parents don't give our kids enough credit for what they are comfortable and able to have conversations about. We just have to give them that. We just have to give them that space. I think that's the thing, is that we often too quickly shut down that conversation with our kids. That's what we find in research as well, right? It's easier for us to tell our kids something than take time to listen to them or to nurture the conversation out of them. And so I think comics can do that. The other thing is that some of the content for the comics actually come from my children. For example, we have a comic where I think the characters are talking about Black History Month and learning about civil rights and different issues. And the character says, you know, why this is actually like about white history, right? The slavery, civil rights, that's about whiteness. You know, it's about white history. And that was straight from my son's mouth.
You're on mute.
It looks like we have one more question in the chat, if y'all would be okay taking it.
I see the question.
Has making the comic
Had
had
any
any negative mental health effects on you in terms of constantly confronting these racial inequalities? You can take that first.
Okay. Yes. There are days where I just have to not read the news. You know, and usually when I'm feeling the stress is when I'll make an angry comic, because I just get so frustrated. You just hear these stories, and I mean, all the things that are happening in our world right now. I mean, how can you not just shake your head and go like, where are we living? What is happening? Like, just the blatant lying and, lack of any sort of morality is just, it just floors me, So I take a break, and then I have to just keep reminding myself of Gen Z, of the future. And, this one quote keeps running through my head constantly, and it's from all people, from a podcast with Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen. They did a podcast last year, and this one little snippet sticks in my mind where Obama is talking to Springsteen, and he says, Bruce, all these kids you see out in the streets, right? They're out there, and they're saying, you taught us all this. You taught us to be compassionate. You taught us to stand up for ourselves. You may not believe it anymore, old people, but we still do. And whenever I remind myself of that, it's like we are the ones that taught them that. And yet somehow we get caught up in everything in life, and we forget that we still believe in those things, but we've gotten so tired that sometimes we just stop fighting. And, in order for change to happen, all of us need to, so now we have the boomers moving out, and now Gen X, our generation, we are the baby boomers, right? And we taught Gen Z all this. How can we meet them and live into this new reality that we want, that we desire?
Thank you. I do have to quickly jump in. We only have about 10 seconds left, and I don't want this to be cut off without thanking you all so much for today's presentation.
Thank you, Chris. Is the room going to close, or can we still talk?
I think it will close.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Actually, it looks like it's still open. So
okay.
If you take 1 or 2 minutes.
Well, if people have further questions, they can just send us a direct message on Instagram. Is probably the easiest. Or you can email theotherOnesByLee@gmail.com.
Alrighty. Well, thank you both so much. Greatly appreciate your insight and everything you shared today. It was really a powerful presentation.
And thanks for having us.
Thank you all.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yes, please.
If you're wondering about how to make comics, just start drawing. I mean, you do it every day. If you do something every day, you're gonna get better. You're gonna get better. You just have to find that discipline, So thank you all.
Thank you.